It's 2:53 in the morning on May 13th, 1909, and the sky over Piazza Loreto is still dark. Under a different dawn, more than a century ago, began a long story that continues today. And who knows if those 127 runners on the starting line felt that they would be pioneers of such a long-lasting competition. First edition, first champions. Men who faced the 2,447.9 kilometers distributed over 8 stages, pedaling on bikes of times past, weighing 15 kilos and without gearboxes, often equipped with fenders and bells. They used to run alone, without a team and without uniforms. And they were alone in facing the unexpected, with the tools that they could carry or that they would find at staging points. If they fell, they'd get back up, and when possible, start pedaling again. The winner of the number 1 edition is Luigi Ganna, a cross-country skier from Varese, bricklayer by profession, and former winner of the Milan-San Remo. That was the beginning. But then there are many other first times to mark the history of the 106 editions of the Giro d'Italia, when they would draw and redraw the route by adding stages until you really include the whole boot, north to south. Or when the men on 2 wheels entered the rankings and also made the history of sport. And then also the first times of the fans, of the enthusiasts, of the audience. The Giro is the Giro of all, wrote Francesco Mosè. In fact, anyone who follows the Corsa Rosa has something to remember. A personal, I was there moment. A first time etched on their memory and then transformed into personal history. The Giro is the Giro because it belongs to everyone, one might even say. The mountain has a simple rule. If you want to go further, you can't go around it. You have to get to the top. This is in Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs. Produced by Dogge in association with Agenzia ICE for an appreciation of the best that Made in Italy has to offer. Episode 10, Monte Lussari, 8 spectacular kilometers. The first times tell the story of the evolution of the Italian race. At 1910, at the second edition, uniforms appear on the athletes, together with some unexpected events that give an idea of what the Giro was like in the early days. A small group of racers was disqualified for having boarded a train, the trenisti, as they would be renamed. And in their defense, we must also remember the conditions of the roads back then, often inadequate for a two-wheeler. Dirt roads, scattered with potholes, dusty, sometimes invaded by fans, onlookers, and even by some animals. There were unexpected events, like what compromised the race of the Frenchman Maurice Brocco. He took the wrong path, got lost, and had to give up on victory. The range of unexpected events was enormous, and also included food poisoning, which affected the men of Italia, forced to take numerous technical breaks imposed by intestinal cramps. Already in the first years, the first cyclists that fascinated the fans rose, like Carlo Galletti, the Squirrel of the Navigli, who won the 1911 edition, the one that began and ended in Rome to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Kingdom of Italy. Right from the start, the Giro looked at what was happening all around the roads, showing its ability to remain relevant today. It was precisely the Squirrel of the Navigli that gave us a show, showing for the first time how the accidents along the way can turn into great feats. After stopping for a bike failure, he caught up during a long chase along 250 kilometers between Milan and Bologna. In addition to Squirrel Galetti, there were also Giovanni Gerbi, the Red Devil, and Eberardo Pavesi to entertain us. From the start, there were also foreigners, such as the dreaded Petit Breton. Thanks to its first champions, the Giro attracted Italians to the street to watch the competition. Squares and sidewalks were crowded by people that wanted to see the bicycles pass, some of them even giving the riders a hand, seized by such enthusiasm as to reach out and push the runners forward. "1914 was the first year in which the riders won with a time classification and not with a points system. And it was also the year that the Giro first learned about the cold. Bad weather haunted the athletes during several stages, forcing many to withdraw. In the mountains of Abruzzo, all trace of Giuseppe Azzini was lost, and he was found only the next day, in a barn where he'd sought refuge from the weather. But the weather wasn't the only problem in that unfortunate year. There were some first controversies between the racers after arriving at the finish line, and an inexplicable boycott, the asphalt strewn with dangerous nails. That wasn't a first though. It had already happened, even in the Tour. Only 8 riders would arrive at their destination, and it's not the only record. This year also presented the longest stage, 430 kilometers from Lucca to Rome, a stage won by Costante Girardengo, the longest time trial of a single stage, more than 19 hours. They were the first steps of the competition, technical tests in anticipation of what would come after the break imposed by the First World War. The first post-war Giro and the first great champion. It was Costante Girardengo, known as Gira, who amazed the fans in that edition of 1919, dominating unchallenged for 10 stages, the first rider to do so, giving the thrill of sport to a country still exhausted by war. Only Binder would repeat this feat, then Merckx, and Bugno. And then there was the first edition that went beyond national borders, that of 1920, passing through Switzerland in the first stage from Milan to Turin. For the first time, the arrival was made difficult by the public, who invaded the trotter, moved by enthusiasm. That edition was run by Tano Belloni, the first number 2 in Italian cycling, a category for athletes who win, but who end up on the road by fate with just one stronger opponent and live in their shadow. Tano's curse was Girardengo. But Gira ends up conferring to Tano Belloni's career a further tone of heroism, since his results are not in question. Eternally second, that's true, but with 2 second places in the Giro, 2 Milan-Sanremo victories, as well as 3 Giri di Lombardia. When Mussolini came to power, we saw the first political influences on the race. More attention was paid to other sports, considered more in line with the ideology of the time. Cycling felt the hit, but didn't give up, remaining very popular among Italians. The 1920s saw the first woman ask with determination to participate in the race, and the organizers agreed. She was Alfonsina Strada, capable of igniting enthusiasm for a year with her presence. It was 1924, when for the first time, tension rose so much as to convince many greats to abandon the Corsa Rosa. Neither Brunero nor Bottecchia competed in the Giro, who stands out for yet another record. He's the first Italian to win the Tour de France in that same 1924. It is again Ottavio Bottecchia who tragically became the protagonist of a still unsolved mystery. In May 1927, his brother Giovanni died in a road accident. He was on a bike. In the car that ran him over was the fascist leader Marinotti, who then offered money to the family as economic repair for the loss caused. Ottavio Bottecchia refused, perhaps sealing his own fate. On June 3rd, he was found dying on the side of the road in the municipality of Trasaghese, where he used to train, with fractures in his skull and clavicle. He died 15 days later, without regaining consciousness and without having the opportunity to talk about what had happened. It was written off as an accident, but then speculations proliferated, and to this day, whether his death was linked to that of his brother remains unknown. Bottecchia's is an isolated case, obviously. The other greats of his era simply got off their bikes, leaving it to the youngsters to replace them. In addition to Girardengo, were Learco Guerra and then Alfredo Binda. Such a strong contender that in 1930 he would receive money not to compete. An absolutely unique event, perhaps in the world of sports in general. To lead to this drastic decision was the fact that his presence would have made the race less exciting for the public, leaving the other runners only the chance to compete for second place. That the first would be his was taken for granted. Maybe without that halt that was bought with an amount equal to the first prize, Binda would have outclassed even the record he holds together with Merckx, that of 3 Tours of Italy won consecutively. A year after that strange decision to leave the champion at home, another novelty appears, destined to mark the whole race, at least in style. The Maglia Rosa appeared for the first time, introduced in 1931 by the organizer Armando Cugnet. The first to wear it was Learco Guerra, and from that moment it became the symbol of the race, as well as a very useful tool to allow the public to recognize the leader of the standings at a glance. But those were also the years of another novelty. To be heard rather than seen. It was the radio, thanks to which Italians could follow the competition wherever they were. For the first time, the race was broadcast and commentated on live. And it was the reporters who made the name of that promising young Tuscan known to everyone. It was Gino Bartali, who wore his first Maglia Rosa in the Campo Basso L'Aquila of 36, and who, a year later, would make the Dolomites a fundamental and inevitable ingredient of the Giro for the first time. It was May 26th. They had to get up to Merano, and Ginetaccio showed what could be done on those climbs, facing Rolle and then Costalunga. The Alpine stages thus entered history. In 1939, Passo Tonale became the protagonist, between Lombardy and Trentino, where Bartali had to stop because of a puncture and several inches of snow, a lethal mix. The mountains would crown champions, but their relevance would be understood later, because in addition to the novelties, the 30s see also the tragedy of war repeating itself. In the 1940 edition, there was just enough time to get to know that 20-year-old coming to the Legnano of Bartali as a follower, but then able to take the Maglia Rosa in the 11th stage and never let go. The era of Fausto Coppi began just before the Giro had to stop for 6 long years of hostility. With peace, the Giro also returned, and once again offered a first time. The post-war years made 2 heroes of cycling, 2 beloved, eternal rivals engaged in a competition that involved the whole country. Athletes who, in the age of radio, social networks were very distant and unimaginable, but television was still a rarity as well. They reached an almost modern level of popularity, entering the popular imagination. The Coppi-Bartali duo and their duels was a novelty of Italian cycling in the second half of the 1940s. Both stood on the podium 7 times, reaping victories. Bartali held the Maglia Rosa for 50 days, 31 for Coppi. The Tuscan wore his first in 1950 and the last in 1954, marking a 14-year career. Aldo Mosè would later do the same for 13 years, just 1 year short. But these are rare cases. These are the first times that the Giro was documented by video cameras, journalists and reporters. The first live TV dates back to 1953. They were technical tests for modernity. The exploits of the greats were immortalized and turned into history. Coppi was the first to achieve that feat in 1949 in Cuneo Pinerolo, confirming the importance of mountain stages for the Giro, climbing 5 hills for 254 kilometers alone, conquering all the mountain GPs one by one. New words and idioms appeared for the first time, such as the fuga bidone of 1954, a concept that can only exist in cycling. Someone who doesn't have a great chance of winning, at least in theory, but at a certain point they push and go on. Those who could catch them up wait, as the situation isn't yet seen as dangerous. Only when the opportunity to catch up with this fugitive is no longer possible, that's a fuga bidone. It happened precisely in 1954 to the 25-year-old Swiss Carlo Clerici, a wingman who just the year before had helped the compatriot Hugo Coblet, a choice that was frowned upon since Coblet was not part of his team. Clerici, in general disbelief, won the Giro, even with the surprising help of Coblet himself, who was also the first non-Italian winner. There were new foreign names in the first places of the rankings, new Italian words to create a dictionary of cycling, fare l'elastico, pulling a rubber band, la libera uscita per i gregari, military leave for the wingmen, the zampellotto, a short and generally undemanding climb which is tackled at high speed but can still be hard for heavier and less agile runners. Hugo Coblet is no exception. At the end of the 1950s, others came to the Corsa Rosa. First of all, the man from Luxembourg, Charlie Gaul, who made himself known with an incredible recovery, the most unbelievable in the history of the Maglia Rosa and the climb to Bondone. There were Louis Mbobé and Rick van Steenbergen, and then Jacques Anquetil, who won in 1960 when the Gavia also appeared for the first time with its spectacular hairpin bends. But it's not just the mountains that entered the Giro's maps. The 1961 edition passed through 17 regions, including the entry of Sardinia into the itinerary. Riders crossed the peninsula, making the country known even beyond its big cities. The Giro was becoming increasingly Italian and was narrated by the great writers and journalists of the country. Indro Montanelli, Gianni Brera, and Enzo Biaggi all lended their pen to the two-wheel competition. The Giro of the last half-century continued to show us firsts. The Cima Coppi appeared in honour of the champion, to which the highest point of each edition is dedicated, and Milan refused the opportunity to host the beginning or the end of the competition. It would start from outside the borders, first in San Marino and then in Monte Carlo in 1966, in the presence of Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier. These were the years of Gianni Motta, Vittorio Adorni, and Felice Gimondi. In 1967, a young Belgian competed in his first tour. First name Eddie, second name Merckx. Soon it was clear to everyone that the era of the cannibal had begun. He who was devouring the whole Giro, including his opponents. He won 5 Giros and then just as many tours, 4 World Championships, 7 Milan-San Remo. As long as he races, there's no competition to be had. The only one who could stand up to him was Gimondi. They relied on the champions to put on a show, but not only them. The Giro continued to amaze. There was the first uphill arrival on Monte Stelvio at 2,757 meters. The image of the riders pedaling towards Piazza San Marco in 1978 is unforgettable. While the following year, it was time for Florence. And while crossing the most spectacular parts of Italy, Francesco Mosè, known as the Sheriff arrived, with 273 victories in his career. In 1990, Mortirolo, a new mountain stage, entered the Giro, and Gianni Bugno became the protagonist of Italian cycling for the first time, keeping the Maglia Rosa from the start in Bari until the very end in Milan. The 90s were marked by the emotions of Miguel Indurain, Eugeni Berzen, and Pavel Tonkov, the first Russians to get noticed. Mario Cipollini was the first great sprinter to conquer the public's heart, earning soon the nickname Super Mario. And obviously, there's 1998, the first Giro that crowned Marco Pantani as absolute king. The Giro has seen many feats, but certain days of the pirate sound like wonderful first times. Mortirolo in 1994, Alpe d'Huez in 97, Selva di Val Gardena in 98, Europa in 1999. Masterpieces, some would call them, made by a two-wheel artist. Pantani was the first great, incomparable and solitary hero who showed strength and also weakness. The champions of the past were athletes. He was also the ordinary man, Pantani. The enthusiasm, the affection, the emotions he aroused were unique. Pantani is unique. With him, the first and the last meet. Zoncolan's first time in the Giro was also the last great climb of the pirate. 106 editions after the first race in 1909, the Giro remains a great trial that Fausto Coppi described as a fight with a gorilla, where you don't give up when you're tired, but when the gorilla's tired. And not only is that gorilla not tired yet, but it's barely begun to reveal what it has to offer. In 2023, it comes with a new climb. One of those where you just have to look at the altimeter graphic to understand that it'll put on a great show. It's the 20th stage, starting from Tarvisio at 752 meters and arriving on Monte Lussari at 1,766, between the Alpi Carniche and the Alpe Giulie, where you can see a breathtaking panorama, provided that your breath hasn't already been taken by the climb. We stand where Austria, Italy and Slovenia touch, between villages and scenery that could appear on postcards. The individual time trial begins with a mostly flat first part, up to the Saisera River, from which you go up towards the sanctuary. The characteristics of the last 7.3 kilometers promise a show, and whoever climbs them by bike will get to admire the landscape later, at another time. Firstly, there are 889 meters of difference in height, with a 12.1% gradient, and they will be the ones to decide the fate of the race. With Monte Lussari, the Gorilla Rosa confirms that it has no intention of giving up. After 106 years, it still looks straight into the eyes of anyone who challenges it. And the party can start. In Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs, is a Giro d'Italia podcast produced by Dog Ear, starring Daniel Tanner, executive producer Marta Donà and Carlo Lenotti. Written by Valentina Camarini, with the editorial support of Giacomo Botto. Directed by Marco Ferrarini. Producer Irene Oriani. Sound design and original music by Pasquale Lo Savio. Recording Dario Cuomo. Artwork Andrea Lodetti. English adaptation Diego Ferrarini. Special thanks to Silvia Forestieri, Eva Visentin and Simone Pozzi.
Una produzione Dog Ear.